All right, so David Foster Wallace once wrote a little story where he said there are two young fishes swimming in the water. And an old fish swims by and he says, "Hello, how's the water?" They sort of look at him, fine. He swims past. The young fish wait till he's out of sight and say, "What the heck is water?" Right? Foster used that story to show us that there's lots of things in our life we take for granted and we don't even question, even some of the most important things. Like culture. The culture we live in, and that's partly what he referred to, is extremely important to us. It's our water, and we should be aware of the water that we're in. Water can be poisonous. Water can have currents we don't like, or currents that can be dangerous. So I would submit that at this point we live in a time that is somewhat unique in our history. For a long time, the tradition of the West was based on two pillars, often referred to as Athens. It was the thought of the Greeks and the culture of the Greeks. Great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. And there was the work of the Romans. The Romans were not necessarily the greatest thinkers, though they were great thinkers, but they were very practical. They created institutions. They created laws. The other pillar was Christianity. Christianity in the biblical context, but Christianity in its endless discussion with the philosophies of the classical time. Those two pillars shaped and formed the culture for at least 2 millennia. It's only relatively recent that started to change. Now, this culture wasn't completely monolithic. Some of the changes and the schools of thought started to occur in the 17th century, right? First was the Enlightenment. Philosophers of the Enlightenment said, we don't really need tradition, right? That is darkness. We don't need old stuff that is darkness. We have the light of our own reason. And the light of the reason can read the book of nature, and we can get a good knowledge, objective knowledge, knowledge that we don't discuss. We can get scientific knowledge. That's the only objective knowledge. And I don't need anybody else to tell me what that is. I can figure that out by myself. The other tradition, and by the way, so this leads to sort of a hyper-rationalism, right? We can fully understand reality. We have the means to do it. It is science. We can also fully organize the world. We understand how economics works. We understand how efficiency works. We can make an industrial society. We can make a mass society. It's all under control. A response to that later on was Romanticism. Romantics said, no. We're not just atoms that are somewhat randomly got together and we can be made into optimal producers and consumers. We are human beings. We have a true self. We are more important than just that. So what became important to them? Well, you need to be true to yourself. You need to discover your authentic self, and then you can discover happiness. And happiness is not finding what is true for everybody. It's what's true for you. It is not what is good, but what is good for you. It's not what is beautiful, but what is beautiful for you. So those two major, well, they weren't major in the beginning. For a long time, they were sort of on the outside of society. It's mostly since the middle of the last century that they've become really prominent. And you can discover them anywhere. And they have started to open a full frontal attack on what is the traditional classical culture. So here's an example. When my son, he was preparing for First Communion, and he was in the religious ed program at the cathedral. And I'm sure the director of evangelization realizes lots of these people that our parents don't really go to church, so I can get them to come to the parish one day, because if they don't come, they don't get communion, so I have a little pressure point there. So we're all invited to a Saturday morning of reflection. It's a pretty big room, you come in, all the round tables, you find your spot. sort of awkward introductions at the table, a little chat, and they've prepared first discussions to get to know each other at the table, right? So you talk a little bit, then the questions have to be a little more personal. 90% of the people doesn't want to share, 5% of the people does, 5% of the people overshares lustfully. And then he calls it all back to sort of, now we're going to have a group discussion of everybody. And the topic he wanted to talk about was discipleship. And he gave a little spiel, and yes, we're all disciples of Christ, and we want to learn, and etc. And it was relatively short. And after that, a woman stood up who was clearly indignant and said, I don't like this thing of discipleship. Nobody needs to tell me what to think. And that is not what Christ told us. Christ told us to not be judgmental, and Christ told us to love each other. He didn't tell anybody what. And why is the church, why does this patronizing institute think it can tell me exactly what I need to think? Now the interesting question is, why does she think that? You can certainly see two aspects of the Enlightenment and the Romanticism in it, right? One is, I determine myself what I think, and B, only thing that matters is what is good for me, not what is good. So I have autonomy and I have subjectivism, and they come together in a sort of strange amalgam. Now the reality is, of course, even if you look at like a Gospel of Luke, I think there's more than 70 references to discipleship in it. But what's also interesting is to really think about what is the difference between this kind of thinking and the classical thinking. In the classical tradition, for a long time, the idea was there is a corpus of thought that we need to master. That is something that we also need somebody who has mastered it to teach us. With the presumption being that we don't know everything and we should learn from things. I have a friend who teaches philosophy of law, and he said these days, okay, if I do Aristotle, if I'm lucky somebody's read it, they will read it once and then tell me why he's wrong. There's quite a few people that think, I don't even have to read him, I know already why he's wrong. Now this is somebody who for millennia has been considered a great thinker. Why do you not even bother to sort of try to understand what he's saying and why he's saying it? And I think that is partly the modern influence. I don't have to, right? He's a white man from the past who, what did they know? We have had progress. We now know things much better. I don't even need to bother. I think that is some of the difficulties we face when we talk about evangelization. There are, one thing the church has not done well over these last decennia is explain or even really fully articulate in an interesting way the wisdom of the tradition. I think, for example, in the tradition, if you look at it, it doesn't have the hubris of the Enlightenment. It's actually not as rationalistic as the Enlightenment. We think we can know lots of things, but there's mystery. There's things where we just have to be quiet, we just don't know. There's also an understanding that to be true to yourself, there's lots of things in myself that are not that good. Right? We believe, and the church has had discussions on this, and say, no, naturally we're not good. We can do some good, but we're not naturally good. We should be aware of that. We should also be aware that that same sin that affects us when we look at ourselves and what we do, it also might even affect our reason a little bit. We might not always see what is truly true because we're somewhat self-absorbed or we're obsessed. So I think these are all very wise things. I think they should really be kept in mind. It prevents a certain arrogance. And that doesn't mean that a Christian can't be a good scientist. It just means maybe he should be aware that science isn't everything. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to be a decent and authentic human being, but let's be a little careful about what we mean by that. What does that really mean? And I do think we need to actually have teachers that know this sort of stuff and believe this sort of stuff. Because if something that happened, certainly in the last decennia, maybe lots of professors that still mouth it, did they really believe it? Maybe not. And I think that is one of the real challenges. And this is where, if you want to engage with a real discussion with this time, it takes a lot of work, and it is much more difficult and much more complex. Did the lady have all kinds of bad intentions? No, she's probably not a bad person at all. And you should probably sit down with her for quite a while to really understand what she's saying and what she's meaning by all of that and what her experiences have been. But I think we also should be aware that we do have a rich philosophical tradition that we should mine and use. So that's what I wanted to give you today.
Thank you very much.